Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's keynote presentation. We are very happy and honored to be the closing day's keynote presentation for the Volo Foundation's Florida Climate Week. We're really excited to share with you for the very first time an important and soon-to-be-released project visualizing sea level rise's impacts on coastal habitats and communities, showcasing pathways for adaptation in one of Florida's most iconic and important regions, Tampa Bay. I'm Daniel Sebastian Padilla Ochoa, Daniel or Danny for short. I am the Senior Manager for Florida Conservation at Ocean Conservancy. I'm a trained urban planner with a concentration in urban and environmental design and a special interest in sea level rise adaptation. At Ocean Conservancy, I lead our Shores Forward initiative, a flagship program to partner with local municipal and county governments to implement projects that bridge the divide between urban and marine environments. In addition to working with local government and NGOs to implement projects, I help lead our work in preparing Florida for the impacts of sea level rise, be it as a resilience strategy, a policy approach, or adaptation measures to safeguard human, animal, and plant communities from the impacts of rising seas. The Florida Conservation Program as a whole works to address water quality, marine debris, and sea level rise in Florida. We are a team of lawyers, urban planners, marine scientists, and government relations specialists. We accomplish our goals by working with local NGOs and government staff. Then we advocate in Tallahassee with the state legislature, and we elevate the stories of residents across the state. We bring these lessons and strategies from Florida to the federal level via our colleagues and teams at Ocean Conservancy. Ocean Conservancy is the nation's oldest marine conservation NGO, celebrating our 50th anniversary this year, actually. Ocean Conservancy's staff of lawyers, scientists, policy experts, and community leaders work with residents and communities across the globe to protect the ocean from today's global challenges. Together, we create evidence-based solutions for a healthy ocean and the wildlife and communities that depend on it. We have accomplished big wins for our ocean by helping write language for bills that became law, advocate for stronger protections for fisheries, and secure more funding for research, climate resilience projects, and federal ocean protection agencies such as NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. In addition to our advocacy wins, we make real impact on the ground. Ocean Conservancy works with ocean advocates on the ground across the globe to reduce plastics in the ocean and our coastways. Through the International Coastal Cleanup, or the ICC for short, from its beginning 35 years ago, we have recruited over 17 million volunteers and collected over 348 million pounds of trash. All of that would have been still today lingering on our beaches and coastways were it not for the countless hours our volunteers have dedicated to cleaning up our ocean. That's a whole lot of bit and information in a short amount of time about my work and Ocean Conservancy's mission. And I hope that after today's keynote and presentation, we can work together to prepare Florida for one of climate change's most hazardous consequences, sea level rise. I will now turn it over to my fellow keynote speaker and friend, Dr. Juan Carlos Vargas. Juan Carlos?
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thanks for the opportunity to be here in this wonderful event today. Like Daniel mentioned, my name is Juan Carlos Vargas. I am the managing principal at GeoAdaptive LLC. We're based in Boston. I am a Costa Rican trained architect, then turned into planner, economist, and computational analyst after, in my postgraduate education. I happen to have the huge privilege to lead a firm that are true believers in change. A group of enthusiasts across multiple disciplines that may range from anything from, environmental planning, public investment, infrastructure and sustainability, landscape architects, data analysts, statisticians, all working together, seeking to provide sustainable, inclusive, and resilient strategies. And that's what GeoAdaptive is. GeoAdaptive is a global analytics and territorial strategy planning company that believes in the transformative power of location. We deploy geographic technologies and advanced data analytics techniques that may range from satellite monitoring and analysis all the way to the power of design thinking, grouping together in each of our teams statisticians and a designer and a planner and a legal advisor, all trying to solve problems because we believe that we need to help transform the world. And that transformation starts with the way that we address problems. And we do that also in a multicultural way. We happen to be incredibly lucky to have locations across the world where we hear and we see problems from different dimensions and from different corners of Earth. And in that sense, we have had the huge privilege to work in over 34 different countries, from the South Caucasus in Eastern Europe to the south of Asia in Nepal and Bangladesh, to Argentina and Brazil, all the way to Haiti or places in the US as Iowa or Puerto Rico or Florida. In Florida, we have had the huge privilege to be there for many years, working specifically with the Department of Interior, Fish and Wildlife Service, among other organizations, NOAA, to work with the state across, the Florida Conservation, and multiple agencies in transportation and water, and helping them see how such an incredible place is transforming itself through development and population change, but also how the environment and the climate is transforming and challenging our assumptions about how should the state be transformed. We have published and put together many work, including the future scenarios of urbanization and climate change in Florida for Department of Interior a few years ago. We model all these conditions in tandem, and I invite you all to check our work. But just right now, to feel incredibly privileged to have the opportunity here, representing a team that has put a lot of work. Sura Biswas, our lead on landscape and urban planning, Antonio, which is one of our designers that is working specifically in how to represent complex issues in simple ways. One of our data analysts, Sean Proctor, which has been essential in understanding and bringing all that data richness and helping us visualize it, analyze it in a simple way. Nevertheless, a great team that has worked on this effort. And of course, thanks to the Ocean Conservancy that has helped us tremendously, has deposited that trust in us, and has more than importantly worked with us along the way to create what we hope it is a very useful tool to all of you that we're excited to share in this session. So thanks, and back to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. When we at the Florida Conservation Program at Ocean Conservancy were exploring how we could add value and help drive decision makers towards more sustainable and nature-based sea level rise adaptation strategies, we started pulling from a lot of the lessons that we have by working with state and local elected officials. We figured that reports and scary graphs work for news clippings and headlines. Dollar figures are a great base to tie budgets and political campaigns on. And imagery and localization of global events like climate change the hearts and linger in the minds of our decision makers. So when we started conceptualizing how it is that we wanted to present information that is out there through innumerable reports and a lot of different strategies that have already been tested and continue to be advocated for on the global scale, we decided that we wanted to have a highly visual, highly dynamic tool where we can see what the impacts on a local level would be from sea level rise, and what are those connections to our coastal habitats, our communities, human and non-human, that depend on them, and then how do we move forward? How do we then look at all the strategies that have been developed and being tested today, right now as we speak across the globe, and how do we take some of those lessons learned to say, these are the different things that you can consider and should consider as key decision makers and advocates like myself and the rest of, I'm assuming, folks that are tuning in today, and then helping make those decisions for pathways essentially more sustainable from an environmental standpoint. That is also why we chose to work with GeoAdaptive. GeoAdaptive's portfolio of work really are the strongest that we saw when it comes to putting planning and strategies to action in a very localized manner and understanding the context within which us, the partners at Ocean Conservancy, work in, and how do we even plan on rolling those out? And a lot of those questions, I think, were pivotal in determining what the product was at the end of the day. I can remember, Juan Carlos, a lot of conversations that we had going into what specific levels of detail we were going into as far as like projections, how were we going to represent the species that were impacted by 6 feet of sea level rise, how are we going to then look at the pathways as a matter of understanding the strategies.
So what we have done and what we are interested in doing was in humanizing that message, in translating that message in simpler terms, and to be able to look at those complex relationships in simpler ways. And the way we thought about it was to create an interactive website that would deliver such message by leveraging multimedia, not only very carefully written narratives, but narratives that will speak to specific graphics, colored plan sections, views, renders, as well as interactive maps that would allow us to look and to zoom and to understand the places that we know, and to understand how that sometimes complex science was translating in a more simpler way that will make me understand, make every person understand how to act. So we were looking for a tool to visualize, inform, and guide actions to increase resiliency in the coastal landscapes of Florida. And I need to say that we're very glad, because it was a very collaborative work with TOC and many other partners. We all conducted a huge effort to gather, synthesize, discuss the meanings of each of these scientific pieces, and to try to put it in the most actionable way for the users of this particular platform. So very excited to see how everyone is going to be using this, and hoping, that will really guide actions to increase resiliency across the state.
What a fantastic segue to actually reveal the tool. And so we'll move now to show you and give you glimpses to the soon to be released product. We're very proud to present to you the Managing Sea Level Rise in Florida web toolkit that was developed by GeoAdaptive in partnership with Ocean Conservancy to help us again visualize what the impacts of sea level rise will be on coastal habitats and communities, and explore some of the pathways to adaptation measures. Why Florida? Why are we talking about climate change in Florida this week? Florida's coastline is second only to Alaska's in terms of its length, which presents an incredible wealth of recreational, environmental resources, but also a lot of exposure, right? When it comes to a state that a lot of the coastline is within feet of the current levels, we are really looking at a degree of vulnerability and exposure that is uncomparable to the rest of the United States. Florida is one of the largest and rapidly growing states in the country. It is said that over 1,000 people move into Florida every single day. In Northeast Florida, I live in Jacksonville, we are seeing about 100 folks move in every single day. And so while it is wonderful that a lot of people are seeing the value and the richness of Florida to raise their families, grow old, and to pursue their professional careers, to now also make sure that we are planning for a sustainable growth pattern and a way to respect our coastal boundaries, so that our environmental resources, our environmental richness is as intact as possible as the state continues to see this unprecedented growth. Juan Carlos, I know that you and GeoAdaptive have done some work in Florida, and I'm curious to hear how some of that work has evolved over the last 10 years, specifically when we've seen some of that large population growth.
Absolutely. Florida, it is a place that you cannot think about climate change without thinking how it affects that built environment, and that built environment that is changing and transforming the state every day. So it is ground zero for us. Now, understanding such changes is not easy. So we have worked, for instance, with the state of Florida to understand how those transformations limit or create possibilities to create new schemes of environmental management, fisheries regulations, to understand what kind of investments are better directed to anticipate those changes, and to be able to consider and promote, to plan for, to create the necessary enabling policies to create a healthy state in the future. So those considerations are essential to why Florida is ground zero for an exercise like this, and why, for instance, those coastal zones, the most affected zones, are key to be looked at specifically, and why, for instance, this work with the Ocean Conservancy is so important for us.
Now I want to dive into what are some of those overlaps. We are going to talk a little bit about the compounding effects of sea level rise and other phenomena that are going to make our exposures and our vulnerabilities in Florida that much greater. One thing that I will add at this point is that we are going to introduce some of the bits in the tool. I really want to leave everyone with a sense of curiosity, so that you come and explore the tool, you come and explore what are the different offerings. For example, in today's presentation and today's tool, what we're revealing is Tampa Bay. In future iterations and a part of the tool that you can access soon, you're going to see that a lot of the different classifications were already started for the rest of Florida.
We want to understand that sea level rise and the effects of climate change overall will not only have that slow onset hazard effect of increasing little by little, well, not so little anymore. We have increased about 8 inches in the 1950s, and we are recently in about a trend of about 1 inch every 3 years in Florida. And of course, the East Coast and the Gulf Coast are the most susceptible areas to faster rates of sea level in the US, much less than, for instance, the West Coast in California. So it is very important here to understand how the multiple ways in which sea level rise is going to affect us, beyond that sort of encapsulation of sea level rise just as this slow transformation in the ocean. We need to destruct a little bit and reconstruct new notions about sea level rise. Let's remember that sea level in specific moments, for instance, let's think of king tides or very high tides, or even in storms, it's going to exponentially increase the levels of inundation. And those is very, very important to understand. For instance, a king tide on a simple 3 feet of sea level rise can get to above 6 or 7 feet of inundation, which is equivalent to about 100-year storm surge in the coast of Florida. So we really need to consider all these interactions, these compounding accumulative effects, in order to be able to prepare across infrastructure, communities, and ecosystems to adapt and mitigate those effects of climate change.
I want to jump into now really looking at some of those ecosystem services that a lot of the coastal habitats provide and some of the stressors that they're facing, but also some of the added challenges that we're going to be having to tackle with sea level rise. So let's understand a little bit more about a lot of these ecosystems along the coast of Florida, and specifically looking at Tampa Bay. And we'll go into a little bit more about like the zooming out of like what is actually Tampa Bay in terms of habitats, in terms of what are the different critical infrastructures that exist there. But for right now, we're going to focus specifically on the ecosystem services, looking at how nature is helping us out already, right? So if we looked from left to right in this section drawing in this visualization, we have the dunes. This is full transparency. When I used to live in Miami-Dade County, I expected dunes to look the same across Florida. I know that's a big surprise to most folks that live outside of Miami-Dade County, but that's what I expected. But also my background was from an immigrant community, and so thus my family, friends, even myself, when the weekends came about, it was a moment of like getting together and figuring out where the rest of us were for the rest of the week. And so we didn't get out to venture much beyond the edges of our like neighborhood. But now that I have the opportunity and the fortune to be able to do so, I now go to the beaches of Northeast Florida and realize that the dune systems across the state look vastly different. And I've had the opportunity to travel across the state because of the nature of my work. And then now I feel like what I've read in textbooks and what I've read in studies and looked in papers now feels true, right? That these large dune systems that sometimes tower over palm trees, that they'll cover everything up until you see the foliage, those are a fantastic resource for us to have one habitat creation for all the animals and plants that need them, but also at the same time, they act as a fantastic buffer, right? So if we
Yes.
look at storm surge, if we look at erosion, they are fantastic features to help us in that.
For sure, and I have a very similar impression. You know, I happen to have relatives in South Florida, Miami, and living in Boston. When we go down there, you tend to have that homogeneous picture of what a sand dune is and how a coastal zone is, and how ecosystems look across the state. And as through the years, as I have gotten the opportunity to go to different places, to different corners of the state, I just come to a great realization and surprise, I will say, for most people out of the state, which is that the enormous richness that exists across coastal zones in Florida. And this drawing that you have in the screen is very emblematic of not only that diversity, but that order that exists in nature, that is incredibly nicely represented in this section drawing, where you see from the ocean, looking at some sort of barrier island or strip, then some interwaters, going into mangroves, going into salt marshes, going into wetland forests, and going into cities where people lived. And of course, as you can see in this section, those conditions have changed. When I go to Miami, for instance, I see hard edge, buildings all the way to the edge of the ocean, to beaches that needs to be renourished constantly, for instance. But as we go to different places, we start understanding this very dynamic relation that must exist between sort of that built environment and the natural resources. As we go to the Northeast, Central Florida specifically, in the west side or the east side, we see very different conditions. And I think that's one of the hard things, one of the magical things, but one of the difficult things that we need to do when moving into advocacy and action at the community, state, government level, which is that we need to understand that all these different ecosystems and their services they provide across all the state are necessary. Because each of them provide different kinds of services to society. Certainly, the dunes provide, a great service of, providing, sediment and nutrient mineralization. And, as we go into different ones, each of them provide different kinds of services, all the way to the wetland forests that trap nutrients and improve air and water quality and things that we really value in Florida. And as you go visit Florida. But the important thing there is that we cannot concentrate action, policy, planning on protecting or managing each of these things independently. We need to think of them as a system. This section drawing is very emblematic of the sort of order that needs to see, is the layering from the ocean to the coastal communities. And it sort of puts a challenge to all of us working in planning and policy, because we know that those natural conditions do not exist in many places in Florida. And therefore it exposes our communities to the destructive nature of natural events, and of course it neglects the population to experience these natural places for everything that they provide, not only enjoyment, but all of the multiple services we see here, from cleaning water and water quality to serving as nursery areas, as habitat for different wildlife, and of course it's most important to protect us from coastal hazards and the risk that everybody in Florida is exposed.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Your livelihood is connected to the pristine or the healthy condition of this, again, what we're seeing in front of us today, of this system from ocean to our urbanized areas, then that'll resolve in a more robust employment opportunity, in a healthier and also in a higher standard of living for families. If that's the way that we presented it to our residents, if that's the way that we presented it to our elected officials, I think we would be having a different conversation. But a lot of times, as you mentioned, one of these is taken in isolation, right? So when we look at, for example, dune restoration, or we look at like coastal rehabilitation, it's usually one of those things that's being addressed, like one of these 5 different ecosystems that's being addressed. And the other part of it is, and you started getting into that, is how these help us mitigate some of the expected hazards that we're going to be seeing in the future with sea level rise, with stronger and more frequent storms. I will take a moment now to recognize that this recording is happening after Hurricane Ian has passed through Florida. We are very, very aware of the impacts that coastal storm surge has taken place in Southwest Florida. And by no means is this meant to say like these are the strategies that need to happen as we look to how to support communities that have been impacted, rather than these are some of the strategies, again, that we've been mentioning since the beginning. Make sure that as decision makers are entering these conversations, we want to make sure that all of the options are on the table, and how do we hold these things with our communities in collaboration so that we can all benefit from this.
We tend to see sea level rise as something that may happen so far from us. So it's so detached, so distant from what I think I or my kids are going to experience, that a lot of people do not care about it. Do not care about how to handle it. And I am generalizing here in a very negative way, but the reality is that's a lot of the realities. That's a lot of the realities I see sometimes in many conversations. And for instance, what this tool is trying to do, those selections of the scenarios related to sea level rise are done with certain specific purpose to not only serve us as a vehicle to understand these compounding effects of sea level rise under different scenarios, 3 feet and 6 feet, but it picks on that 6 feet for one specific reason. One is a intermediate higher scenario in the future, but it also is the average of the storm surge that we'll experience in devastating storms. Ian is on preliminary reports is just about 7 feet above sea level. So that type of experience that we experience with Ian is not very different to the transformations that we are capturing here in this tool. So as such, the tool does not mean to be a prescriptive tool. It intends to be a vehicle to explore. It is a vehicle to learn, a vehicle to gather around the table, to see the options that it provides in this sort of synthesized understanding of all the complexities, and to make decisions to avoid situations like that in the future, to rethink how to rebuild, to give a new value to a lot of these ecosystems, to think how to provide space for those ecosystems in our newly rebuilt communities, which I'm sure they will be resilient, because there's nothing to make you rethink the way that you go about something in life as devastation. And in this sense, I'm hoping, and as everybody in our team, hoping that this tool will really serve that purpose, to trigger the conversations, to inform these conversations, to guide some of those actions, but not to be prescriptive, but to serve as a model to think about what could be done. Then each community, decision makers across the state will have to think what degree of some of these solutions, what degree of consideration across these different ecosystems needs to be in place in order to secure the resiliency of their communities.
And as we can see here, I mean, a lot of the 5 different habitats that we would see in a ideally healthy ecosystem along the coast would help in that, right? And not just in the way that they would, again, reduce the impact of storm surge, reduce the impact of chronic flooding from a storm, or for example, from a heavy downpour, flash flood, but more than anything, it's that compounding effect of, yes, it will help, for example, in dunes or even in mangroves, they will help reduce the wave energy. But at the same time, throughout their whole lifespan, throughout the time period of their health, through the pristine working conditions that they need, they will also provide these immeasurable benefits to communities, right? So we mentioned fisheries. At the same time, air quality, water quality, looking at the benefits of recreational on a public health standpoint. And so when we look at some of these benefits that we have from a healthy coastal habitat, it's not just to be held in your mind as this is just for storms, this is just going to be for like, how do we prepare for storms? But these things can be dynamic. These systems are designed by nature to resist, to also adapt to the changing conditions that we're experiencing. And so then the next step that I want to get into is looking at what are some of the stressors that sea level rise is actually going to create on these systems. And so I mentioned that they adapt. We would expect that a lot of these habitats are going to be negatively impacted, whether it's because of the changing, as Juan Carlos mentioned earlier, in the salinity, right? As more saltwater moves inland, the habitats, the species that depend on a Goldilocks condition to thrive. So for example, mangroves. Mangroves are emblematic of these conditions. They need a specific threshold for salinity. They need a specific threshold for the amount of air that they need to be exposed. Their roots need to be exposed for a certain amount of time. All of these things are expected to change. And so as these things change, we then need to think forward and say, how do we accommodate these adaptations for these ecosystems so that not only is it self-serving in that regard of how do we ascertain that we continue to benefit from nature, but also how do we continue to safeguard nature so that it's able to adapt and not just resist until the breaking point, and then at which point we're just going to have to hardly, and by that I mean gray infrastructure, engineer our way out of the problem. So part of that thinking is to realize that sea level rise not only presents a threat to us as humans and our communities and our neighborhoods, but also to the natural ecosystems that we see as protectors, that we see as providers as well. And so those are some of the stressors that we're expecting to see from sea level rise. And again, there's a lot more detail in here than we're able to go into in today's presentation, but there are also pressures that are existing today from patterns of land use and human activity that are ongoing and that they need to be, again, planned for and properly thought of. Juan Carlos, can you walk us through some of these current stressors?
Absolutely. And we tend to think, again, of climate change and sea level as this sort of massive amount of changes that is occurring because someone else is doing things outside of our communities. But really, a lot of the unsustainable patterns that we induce in our communities through land use, to where we decide to build or we decide to carry specific commercial activities and such, may also further compromise the ability of these coastlines to withstand sea level rise. We all in Florida, and as we visit Florida, we're very aware of the amount of development that is occurring. So when development occurs in coastal zones, for instance, it really harms the ability for habitats to adapt, because it basically puts them against the wall. They don't have a space to move. They don't have space to naturally migrate or experience the succession process. When we actually, for instance, as well, when we develop commercial activities within coastal zones, we harm marine ecosystems and marine species and pollute. When we overfish, we diminish the ability to also be able for those fish stocks to replenish and, of course, to continue evolving. All that noise, movement also changes eutrophication. It changes the way that, in the natural processes occur in these spaces. And of course, in addition to that, all that development, all those land use changes also invokes specifically infrastructure, connectivity infrastructure or hard infrastructure that is a reaction to try to now contain some of the transformations we see. And needless to say, the massive and intense amount of urbanization that is occurring near our own coastal zones are actually displacing habitat, are destructing some of those habitats. And with that, we are destructing our ability to adapt to these changing conditions. In summary, we cannot see the impacts, the negative impacts that we experience from sea level rise just as a exogenous factor that is arriving to our coast. We need to see how the activities that we as as inhabitants of these areas we induce through our changes also compromise that ability for those ecosystems. So we need to come up with strategies that allows us to sustain, maintain, protect these ecosystems and find the most suitable ways in which we can carry our economic activities, our day-to-day activities, where we build, when we go to recreate. How are we going to enjoy this wonderful environment that Florida provides us all without affecting these particular, ecosystem services and conditions that we are transforming and which are very, very difficult to reverse. So we need to sort of have that into consideration. Then back to you.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. I couldn't agree more. And part of the challenges in making space for nature to adapt is making sure that we are also adapting to these needs, right? So holding other systems and their needs into account, as much as, for example, as we talk a lot about equity in our social outcomes, it's the same mindset that kind of leads to a multi-benefit outcome where we are considering how can we adapt as humans, as our society needs to figure out how to move forward, but at the same time, let's move forward with nature, let's move forward with our environment that has gotten us this far. With that, I'm going to move us a little closer to home. And so now that we have a broad strokes understanding and also a common language around what we're going to be discussing for the rest of the hour, we're looking into Tampa Bay. What you see here is the result of, first of all, defining what we are calling Tampa Bay. So let's start there. It's not going to be just the Bay of Tampa, but what we're defining as the region connected to the metropolitan, so the economic output of Tampa Bay, the cultural and social connectivity, and then also the ecosystem connectivity across this region. You will find more information if you go to classifying Florida's coasts in the second section here that I'm hovering over right now. And so with that, so that you can hopefully see where this jump was made, we are going to explore looking into Tampa, the coverage of habitats, and then looking at the overlay with our income groups within our communities. And so where do these overlay and how do these interact? As you can see here, the amount of ecosystems and habitats that exist throughout the Tampa Bay region are vast and they are varied, right? So you have everything from the typical coastal habitats that we find, for example, the uplands, the hammocks, the beaches, and then of course we move into the mangroves, salt marshes, and the tidal flats that we all usually see when we're driving out to the beach, when we're passing by, for example, the bridge, we start seeing some of these like mixture of conditions between ocean conditions and further inland. And then in addition to that, you have a smattering of coral reefs, you have some hard bottom habitats, and then moving further inland, you have again this like less saline, more freshwater conditions. And so I'm going to pause there and I'm going to bring us down. As you see, there are a lot of different files. Essentially, there are different data sets that you can pull up to see how these are overlaid and interact. But we're going to focus today on habitats and our human communities. And so the proxy that we're looking at for the vulnerability of human communities is looking at the income levels. As you can see, so going through, the greener, essentially the lower income the community is, and the more purple it is, the higher income they are. And so especially calling out the attention of one, you have a concentration of higher income communities near the coastline. So on our barrier beaches, on our peninsulas, looking at our coastline. And then as you move farther north, so farther away from the metropolitan economic centers, you do start seeing a drop in the income levels. And of course, there are pockets, for example, if you zoom into St. Petersburg, into Tampa, of course, you're going to have communities of lower incomes, but they start being more widespread the further north you move, which not only should be a focus area for example, public housing, for transportation, and again, as we said, these multi-benefit projects, like for example, in sea level rise adaptations, but they have this interesting overlay with our habitats. And so as we look to the north, and we'll give this a few seconds so it looks a little prettier. As we look to the north, we have a really dense and rich ecosystem. We have a wide range of habitats that represent countless species. And again, these, if you remember from the income file, you will see that a lot of these are in the same area. And so as we consider adaptations, as we consider how we're going to be tackling adapting to sea level rise, we really need to have an equity mindset in place. And what I mean by that is that we need to make sure that the most vulnerable communities, being on the animals, so like the marine environments, the coastal habitats, but also on the human side of things, right? So our lower income
Mhm.
families, they are not receiving the same level of funding that every other community is receiving and support, but they really need to be receiving more, not just because they're more necessitous, they're more requiring of, for example, extra infrastructure, updating, maintenance, public transportation, housing, but at the same time, they are the stewards of a richer ecosystem. Therefore, they stand more to lose, but also more to gain from the future, which Juan Carlos is so optimistic about. And I also think that we can get there, but we can only get there as long as we know that these things are real and we know that these things are present in a spatial temporal scale. And that meaning in a specific place at a specific time. And right now, we know that these two things are happening in the same areas. Juan Carlos, any insight that you would like to add on to that?
No, Daniel, just to mention that this is a section of this tool that we're incredibly excited about. This is putting information at the fingerprints of every user, regardless of the education level, regardless of income level, regardless of knowledge about scientific transformation or economic power forces within the market. It allows the user to zoom in and out, to print it, to understanding in very simple terms, and then to have text that helps you guide you through some of that reading. As you can see, there's no clear pattern, of how any section of a linear mile is. And that heterogeneity, that differences across all the systems, is important to recognize and important for communities to have access to it. If I'm a community in the northern part of Tampa, I have a socioeconomic condition, my composition across my habitats, my infrastructure, my amount of conservation, amount of services, and other things changes. So it is essential to recognize that diversity, to empower people with the simple access to information, and for them to be empowered to that information to guide decision making, to set up the partnerships, to scale their concerns or to downscale their understanding of what's happening with these communities. And that's very essential. With access to this, you have there, for instance, you're wondering how sea level is going to affect me. If I live in any of the parts of this region, you can zoom in, you can see what kind of habitats are present there, you can see what is the socioeconomic conditions surrounding me, I can see what infrastructure is serving our communities, and of course, the level of protection that they have, what sort of imperiled species are present there, what is my water condition, how is agriculture located. I mean, there's a wider range of information that will be accessible through the tool to all these communities, and to be able to just better understand very heterogeneous context and that changing context that we're just referring in the last section of this particular tool.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. One of the things we wanted to make sure that were kept throughout the development of this tool was, again, in those conversations that we were having, and like the visualization, the visual nature of this tool makes it, one, easier to understand, easier to navigate, but also it looks to change the way that we are feeling about sea level rise and climate change at the household level, right? Like if you can make the connection of like, in my neighborhood, I see we're going to be impacted by sea level rise to this extent, but also in my neighborhood, I didn't know that we had these habitats, right? I didn't know that this was the level of, for example, vulnerability that we have for the protected areas. And so that I hope will create a lot of discussions, a lot of conversations within communities, but also within decision-making like rooms, right? As we look to prioritize areas, as we look to work through the different avenues that are presented. We're now going to move into two specific areas that will showcase so that you can get a sense of what the rest of the tool looks like and feels like. We won't go into the species impact here, but you can play around with this when you finally get to see and interact with the tool into what are some of the anticipated outcomes and impacts from sea level rise on these different iconic species around Tampa Bay. We're going to jump into one, we're going to look at wetland communities and ocean communities. We have tabled the different landscapes that you find around Tampa Bay into these community settings, and we're going to be looking into these two, the wetland and the ocean today. So starting off from a place that actually we were focusing on in the Tampa Bay map, in the wetland communities near actually Crystal River. So if you're familiar with the area, so this is actually Crystal River here, and this is oftentimes the channel, the body of water that a lot of folks kayak, paddle down. And once you get out into beyond the extent of this particular map, you start hitting into, like, for example, the mangrove islands and things of that nature. The thing that I am most excited to show you is the following. The devastation from 6 feet of sea level rise is widespread. The impacts are varied, and the impacts are also nuanced. What you are not sometimes seeing when, for example, you see images or superimpose, like, for example, like a Photoshop image of like a flooded area is, what about the ecosystem habitats that we were talking about before, right? So looking at the seagrass, looking at the marshes, the forest wetlands, how are they going to be impacted? And so what is their coverage? Are they going to be able to recover? And then what are some of those, like when Juan Carlos was talking about earlier, about those compounded effects, right? So if a particular point is going to be inundated at 3 feet of sea level rise, you can more than guarantee that when it gets to 6 feet of sea level rise during a storm event, that space, that habitat is going to be overwhelmed. And so if there's any lesson to take from these really quick glimpses as to what this visualization tool provides, is that level of compounding effects of sea level rise taken together with the other impacts of climate change. Juan Carlos, did you have something that you would want to add about the specific place?
Yes, indeed, Daniel. This is a condition that is fairly typical of the northern section of our study region, like you mentioned, around Crystal River, but repetitive across numerous other locations and communities in the northern section of the study region. The important thing about this is that if you remember the map that Daniel was showing you, this northern part is the part that is very rich in the mosaic of habitats and the presence, the magnitude of the amount of habitat that exists in the northern part of our prairie region. And you can see that here. You can see those seagrass and salt marshes and freshwater forested wetlands being affected, serving basically as this cushion, this buffer to those first levels of the sea level rise around 3 feet. But if you don't mind, Daniel, clicking again to see the little video, well, a lot happens. We devastate completely an important set of ecosystems, but they are basically sacrificing to really buffer us, those communities, from those effects. But it is at the level of 6 feet where really substantial damage and inundation that could be either sea level rise or storm surge, as we discussed, begin to happen. The key question to ask ourselves here is, like, how could we continue expanding, enhance those habitat conditions so they can keep providing us with those services to buffer us? Where do we locate conservation, though? How could we manage a specific habitat so we can give them that room to move? We know that succession, the changes in the location and the configuration of our habitats as water is coming into land a lot more, as those salinity levels changes, as those acidity levels changes, they will move natural. They're very generous in their flexibility and their resiliency. But if we get them against a hard edge, that could be a built community, it could be a seawall, it could be a marina. If we don't give them space to move, they're going to be in crunch and basically disappear eventually under these conditions. So we need to think ahead of time. We need to think proactively to see how we accommodate the necessary spaces in areas like this in Crystal River, to see how we could accommodate our growth in a way that does not get necessarily in the middle of the pathway, and to provide that natural succession, how we can help them accelerate succession in a way that, it provides overall sustainability and resiliency for these communities, regardless of their income level. And how we avoid what is happening lately, how development is biting basically into that salt marsh, into that forested wetland areas, and therefore getting overexposed to these harming forces of sea level and, of course, of overall climate change.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because in the last section that we're going to go into in a few minutes, we really look at how to make space, right? How to make space for nature to be able to adapt. And so we talked about that resiliency up until a breaking point. And so how do we make sure that we are accommodating the movement and the space needed for these changes of salinity and these changes of exposure to air and to water? And so that's also why we selected this particular community up in the north extent of Tampa Bay, because this presented one of the opportunities to go into detail about the less developed areas that still have a really good opportunity to safeguard the future success and health of their ecosystem. Now we're going to jump into essentially the total opposite. So what happens in a condition where we have built out to essentially the coastline and we still have habitats within our spaces, but again, looking at those pathways to allow the movement of water inwards, so actually living with the water, we are really limited in that regard. And so we have, for example, in this case, we have Treasure Island and the string of islands that connects to metropolitan St. Petersburg. And essentially what you see is that a lot of this would be almost chronically impacted just at 3 feet of sea level rise. And that is due because, again, we didn't provide space for the movement of water. And so now we need to think of proactively, how are we going to safeguard? And so there are opportunities for adaptation. That doesn't mean you need to relocate the entire community out and, for example, serve the entire string of islands as breakwater features, but you can actually add a lot of resiliency features to safeguard for the foreseeable future. And so you will get into those in a little bit, but it's definitely not a doom and gloom scenario, but it is a very eye-opening and a very realistic outlook into what we can expect in ocean communities. Juan Carlos?
No, very much indeed, Daniel. This provides an important lesson, and it's of concern because places like these are the economic engines of a lot of the surrounding communities.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to think, we cannot take this in a sort of romantic conservation way. We need to think very proactively, very realistically, that these engines of economic development, particularly related to this tourism economy and commercial economy, places like St. Pete,
Mm-hmm.
where in this mosaic of urbanization do we have opportunities to let nature take over some of those areas and continue providing those flows of environment and services, and in helping us ameliorate the devastating impacts of sea level rise and climate change overall. So here, the challenge that we have is, with this level of devastation, in this level of urbanization, what should we do? We need to rethink our relationship with these potential changes that are occurring in the near future to us, or it can occur any minute, like that sadly happens with Ian, where it create evidence that this is actually a very real situation, that we don't need to wait 100 years for it to occur. So yes, very much a very different case than the first case. The challenge over there is to think about how to continue providing that big buffer. Here's how we can create the buffer when we already eliminated it to start with.
Part of now the next wave of thinking, now that there is a larger and growing body of work behind what are some of those histories, and what are now, for example, we have tools like the one that is in front of you today. If we know that we're going to be losing properties in specific places, what do we turn those places into, right? Because you can only rebuild so many times. For example, like if we look into the interior here in the area that I'm hoping you can see, so in the center right, if you're looking at it towards St. Pete, if you're expecting this area to flood more and more often, and you start seeing homeowners not wanting to withstand the risk of living there, then you enter the conversation where you get to explore. You get to explore, what do we do with this land? What do we do with the connectivity of this land to the next parcels, and so on and so forth? How do we adapt to that, and how do we take advantage of these opportunities to actually prepare and adapt in a way that is sustainable and a way that also that is equitable? And so with that segue presented, we're going to shift to what are some of the adaptation pathways that can be employed in these two specific areas. Juan Carlos, can you guide us through how we have organized the adaptation pathways into these 4 buckets?
Absolutely. Specifically here, we organized across these 4 concepts, and then we built about 40 different specific actions informed by the vast literature that exists across Florida. Multiple organizations, institutions have advocated for, as well as take some of the most official actions from EPA, NOAA, and other federal and national level programs. So 4 specific things that we're thinking about, and this is in very sequential order, we looked specifically at protect. That's the first overarching strategy. In protect, we mean to organize regulatory conservation planning strategies that are needed for functioning ecosystems to operate in a rapidly urbanizing region, as the one that we just saw in St. Pete. And here is incredibly important to understand the regulatory framework and to act a bit about, see we can protect those ecosystems. But protection is only one part. And that's where our second strategy comes in, which is to restore. And restore means organize strategies that improve the ecosystem services, that enhance them in some way. But first to restore those flows of particularly degraded ecosystems that are suffering because of pollution that we discussed across our days, or because other environmental impacts like runoff from urbanization, or just the transformation of some of these natural filters that occur between communities and natural systems. Restore, we need to really create the linkages between land and water and sediment flows. So it's not only about patterns, it's about the flows that occur between them. Then we have enhance. And here's what landscapes, required to face sea level rise. And specifically what we mean with enhance is to identify specific action and strategies that can help ecosystems adapt to changing conditions and become more resilient to climate impacts. And we all know in our communities, places that are functioning well and places that we know are not functioning well, places that are dying, that are diminishing their ability to continue protecting here. So we need to find a society ways in which we enhance them, we inject them with the necessary functions to really confront and face those sea levels that are going to be affecting. And lastly, construct. And I don't want to be too negative about this concept. Here's really is like we discussed in the last case in St. Pete, is to have the discussion, have the societal exploration to think about how to repurpose some of those areas that are being affected by sea level. Daniel, back to you.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. And I know that must have been really difficult to summarize in such a short amount of time. Again, I don't want to belittle any of the effort that really went into as a whole collaborative effort to come up with those 40 strategies. They are a fantastic repository of going through and really looking at what are the different options that communities, that cities, that counties have as they prepare for sea level rise. I'm actually going to give you a small glimpse. And so these are the wider categories that you have within the 4 different strategies. Within each one of these, you have a kind of a subsection going into more detail as to like what those specific adaptation strategies would look like. And so I strongly encourage you to delve deep as soon as the web tool is released. For more news on that, I will get to at the end of the presentation in a short bit. So jumping into what these look like in specific places, and remember, this isn't not meant to be prescriptive. This is meant to be exemplary of what are the kinds of considerations that you could examine, that you could explore. We've selected a few that we thought were going to resonate more with the conditions and the expected impact from sea level rise that will be in these kind of landscapes. But of course, again, there are 40 strategies throughout this document. And so really encouraging any decision makers and advocates to explore all of them before really going and completely committing to just one of those strategies as the solution, because oftentimes it is not going to be one, but it is going to be a myriad of strategies and solutions that will get the job done. And so we have, again, near Crystal River, we looked at the protection of those ecosystem functions, protection of what are some of those habitats, and to not fall prey to the tempting opportunity to just stick with what we explored for this specific place. What I will share from our workings and our projects within the Ocean Conservancy in Florida, we have been working with communities, specifically with decision makers at the municipal level, at how do we protect some of these habitats. And so a lot of these things come down to, for example, monitoring, and a lot of it comes down into implementation and enforcement. looking at, for example, from nutrification. So looking at fertilizer ordinances, looking at how do marine debris get trapped before they reach our ecosystem so that they don't contribute to, for example, the concentration of pollutants and chemicals found oftentimes in derelict plastic vessels that we find in mangroves, for example, or marshes or forest wetlands. And so these kinds of um, more legislative approaches to fixing a very physical kind of challenge of protecting these habitats, those are the kinds of solutions that we need to be aiming for. Those are the kinds of things that Ocean Conservancy has been working directly with municipalities to make sure that those things are implemented so that we don't have a situation where an ecosystem is on the brink of collapse due to the lack of protection. We also have an example of restoring some of those flows, right? So not just water, but also sediment. And a lot of times that comes down to the connectivity, right? So if we look at, let's say, a highly urbanized, a highly canal focused water infrastructure system, we look at Miami-Dade County, right? And a lot of those canals were made to get water from one place to another as quickly as possible, but that also bypasses a lot of the natural ecosystem functions of a lot of these pathways, a lot of these connectivities from going into inland from the ocean and vice versa. And so looking at opportunities where we can restore some of those flows to, for example, let mangroves have more of that soil accretion, have more of those freshwater and saltwater flows coming in and out of bays, of estuaries and marshes, those are fundamentally important. And so we have been, for example, on Army Corps projects that are usually presented in the districts, we have been working with communities and figuring out how do we advocate for more of those connectivity approaches so that we can actually see in the future, because a lot of these things, and I will take a little segue here, a lot of these projects that are I envisioned to restore this connectivity, they won't bear fruit in a visual manner for years to
Mhm.
come, right? And so we need to keep this pathways approach in mind. And that's why we've been using pathways instead of like, this is the chronological order, or these are the different projects that you need to do and you call it a day. It's about a pathway. If you want to get to a place where you can just solely rely on green infrastructure to safeguard your communities from sea level rise, you're going to have to take many steps there. And so some of these things, like for example, restoring flows, those things, if you do today, you won't see the full benefit further down the line. And we can't lose sight of that, but we need to make those investments and we need to make those actions now so that we can do the rest of the things that are dependent on a restored flow.
Mhm.
Hopefully that wasn't too much down a rabbit hole. And now we would move into enhance. How do we enhance the resilience of these ecosystems, of these habitats, to actually adapt to climate change? Again, there is a limit to how much resilience we can build in. And so this is, again, one of those things that you can take in the beginning stages to really start considering, well, we can't allow water to just sit here for example, if we look at the seagrass meadow right here, um, you can't allow seagrass to live in just salt water continuously without any mixture of that freshwater and brackish water mix, and including the oxygen levels. But how do you actually safeguard some of those so that you can actually provide these oases in the meanwhile while the migration of these habitats occurs, right? So as these habitats are going to be moving inland, how can you create these spaces so that the flora and fauna that depend on these habitats can have time to acclimate, right? And so we're seeing some of that, especially in Northeast Florida, where we have a high erosion rate because it's still a less developed coastline, where we have the opportunity to think about how do we design spaces so that we can enhance what we have right now and allow the migration of things as we move further down the line, as we get closer, for example, to a 2100 scenario. Last but not least, we talked about for example, the repeated loss properties and the buyout programs. Essentially, that's what we get into here. We look at the purchasing of upland development rights, but looking at transferable rights of development. And so those are all more, as far as I see it, and from Carlos, I'd be kind of curious to see if you disagree. I I see them more as these economic and policy tools that really need to be thought of in a very creative fashion. I think for a lot of the development and land use patterns that we see in Florida, they are the product of a lack of creativity as far as how we are willing to envision how we need to build. And so as
Yeah.
we make space for the migration of salt marshes, of seagrass, of mangroves, and all of the different habitats that exist throughout Tampa Bay and throughout Florida, we really need to be creative about how we are working with developers. So, and when I say we, I'm really talking to you, municipal and county staff. I'm looking at the planning organizations, but most importantly, I'm looking at the commissioners and the council members. At the end of the day, the planning agencies are an advisory kind of staff and department to the council members and the commission members. And thus, the kind of the bull stops at where the local elected officials allow development and allow the real estate industry to progress. And so there are a lot of mechanisms economically that we can leverage to make sure that we are preparing for what we need to prepare for and also safeguarding what we have so that we can allow the migration of these ecosystems inland. And one of those things, for example, is transferable development rights, and a lot of these other purchasing approaches to how do we get the land that we need to have so that we can migrate these species. The last thing we wanted to get into, and again, this is going into the second community that we showcase, developed area all the way out into the coastline. And so these adaptation measures are very different, right? So looking at, for example, the development rights and looking at like how do we buy more and like expand more, protect more, and enhance, but this is different, right? A lot of this is looking at restrictions of how do we avoid further exposure, further vulnerabilities and risk, right? Because a lot of it comes down to, and you've probably seen in the news this week, the conversations around the financing of building in a risk prone area, right? Like somewhere that is vulnerable not just to sea level rise and storms, but also vulnerable to a uh, a lack of infrastructure maintenance. For example, if you're looking at water infrastructure and the delivery of water to your specific neighborhood, if you're out on a coastal island, is contingent upon a lot of systems that are going to be impacted by sea level rise chronically moving forward, right? So if you have a failing stormwater system, if you have a failing potable water system, those things are only going to get worse as climate change exacerbates and as climate change speeds up. And so a lot of that comes down into the restriction, and we can talk about that at length. And I'm sure a lot of folks that are tuning in from across Florida have a lot of experience into trying to restrict some of the development. And again, this ties into looking at what are some of the different avenues to do that. Um, Preservation of the complexity that exists right now, right? So that we have, like, for example, in Tampa Bay, you do have a system of dunes that is fairly effective at maintaining some of that ecosystem service. And so how do we actually preserve some of that as long as we can? Looking into the restoring of the flows of the dunes to the uplands. So we talked a little bit about that when we had that diagram of the horizontal section, looking at the dunes, and we went into looking into what some of those sediment deposits and nutrient kind of transferring from the ocean to inland. You have the same system here, right? Where you need to think through the vegetation that will help, for example, the dunes once they are overwhelmed, right, with sea level rise. And so when we looked at the 6 feet of sea level rise in this particular community in St. Pete Beach and Treasure Island, at one point, you're going to require the help of a lot of native vegetation that can provide some support to those overwhelmed systems in the dunes. And then also at the same time, if you start thinking through the essentially the coastline is going to shift to these extents. So if you look at the screen, if we're expecting the coastline to be moving further inland, you can already start thinking about what specific native fauna and flora you have that can actually provide those services. So we look at, for example, the specific types of plants that you can select, and also the specific types of habitats that you can create that not only provide the recreational and the environmental protection and also the environmental services, but also looking at those protections from sea level rise. How do we elongate the recreational and the commercial economic opportunities from the beaches? And a lot of that comes into, for example, like groins and looking at other opportunities to preserve some of that sediment so that we can elongate that lifespan. It is essentially a community and economically focused adaptation measure because we recognize that We can't just expect communities to uplift and then transfer everything that they have, their social connections, their networks, and then also their workforce and housing. And thus, we need to make sure that we're buying enough time so that we can actually continue the processes that are currently ongoing in our coastlines. And then in tandem with everything that we've been talking about, preparing these communities, and really I'm looking at our human communities, how do we move to a place that we are less prone to vulnerabilities from sea level rise and our risk levels are much lower.
For me, this strategy, when we talk about enhancing this particular community, is how can we create a buffer for those ecosystems that buffer us? And their specific mechanisms, all very attainable, all very much within the purview of what communities and counties can do. So how can we help them buffer us to enhance those ecosystems?
Oh, thank you for that, Juan Carlos.
Mm-hmm.
And lastly, we look at the deconstruct or construct. And so we look at the armoring, we look at how to protect some of those coastlines. And so here's where I think we go into what most folks are most familiar with when it comes to green infrastructure or nature-based features. We look at living shorelines. We look at groins to promote some of that sand accretion in beaches. And there are a lot of other examples. So for example, we have breakwater features via artificial reefs, oyster reefs. You have just artificial breakwater features they're manufactured that are more of on the architectural side of things. And all of these measures are to, again, elongate the amount of time that we have for these ecosystem services, for these habitats to acclimate. And then also if we can see if we can mitigate some of these areas. And so that kind of encapsulates all of the things that we were thinking about as we looked at these two specific sites as examples of what this tool has to offer. There are 7 communities, can go into in detail in the visualization of how sea level rise will impact them, and then also how the adaptation pathways can help prepare for the worst impacts of sea level rise in this 6-foot scenario. Of course, we could have chosen a higher scenario, in which case we would have had a slightly different conversation. But again, we want to make sure that we are on the actionable side of things and then also on a more realistic side of things if the current trends of carbon emissions keeps up to speed. With that, I would like to invite Juan Carlos in joining me some closing remarks, and I really appreciate the opportunity to present this very soon to be released tool with you all.
Thank you, Daniel. And thanks everybody for also the opportunity to share this work with all of you. We're very grateful to the Ocean Conservancy and to everybody that is interested in using this tool. We're really hoping that it will induce action. It will create a more dispersed, more useful knowledge for all of us. And we're really hoping that this beyond visualization can really help inform and guide actions in each of your communities. Change needs to occur, it needs to start in our communities. And that's what we have really taken the time to prepare all these materials for all of you. Once again, thanks so much, everybody, and specifically to the Ocean Conservancy and to Daniel for this wonderful session, and really looking forward to see and to hear how all of you use it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the day.